returned to his hometown again to present another History at High Noon program. Today's topic is musical memories, first movement, and how we learn to sing and play. Dave grew up in Sturgis, participating in school and church music programs from at least the 5th grade through high school. Now it's 73, that's a mistake. One of his deep life regrets is not continuing as an amateur musician after the summer of 1965, when he remembers playing his baritone horn one last time for the Titans baseball, a season opener. Dave and his wife live in Rapid City on a street with 3 other super families. That just seems like a lot of coincidence. He's retired from a hodgepodge career as a newspaper reporter, military public affairs officer, website administrator, and tour guide. And we are so lucky to have him here in Sturgis with us. We'd like to welcome you, Dave.
Thank you very much. It's always good to come home, and in the last several months I haven't been home often enough, and I think all of us suffer from that. You know, the times that we're living in now, and all of the confusion and the disembobulation. No, I'm not saying that right, but anyway, it's been a mess, and we all have to hope that it goes away and we can return to some semblance of normal. Well, musical memories. Dodie Lee talked to me, gosh, it's been more than a year ago now, for what are you going to do next, Dave? And so I had thought about this topic a little bit prior to her asking me the question, and felt that there's got to be a story with music in Sturgis, one way or another. And I started to scratch at it just a tiny little bit from my own recollections and from family members and friends, and quickly realized that, kind of like Sheriff Johnny Yeager's stories, you could do at least 2 books about music in Sturgis. And I'm going to condense things into 2 programs. Today is the first movement, how we learn to sing and play. And then as my research continues, and hopefully I can enlist the assistance of some other Sturgis people, we'll put on the second movement about performance itself. So today I'm going to concentrate mostly on sort of the structure, the academic structure, and the technical, the learning structure of how music has come into our community. And then some months from now, we can come back and listen more to some of the performances of musicians from Sturgis, or Sturgis people who've gone on to perform elsewhere as well. So I'm going to try to paint with that really big broad brush in the second chapter of all this, or the second movement of all of this. In my research yesterday, I had an opportunity to talk to my high school classmate Bill Grams. Bill and Bob, brothers, are the 4th generation, I believe, of the Grams family to be either living in Sturgis or connected deeply with the root and the roots of this community. And Bill's a musician, continues on as a musician. He doesn't have any life regrets about not singing and playing, because he does both of those things from his home in Kennewick, Washington, where he's lived now mostly in retirement for several decades. But Bill reminded me that it was the heavenly gates, St. Peter on duty first thing in the morning. The applicants are lining up to come into heaven, and there's 3 people at the head of the line. And one of them comes up, and St. Peter asks the question, how much money did you make, and what was your profession when you were on earth? And this junior angel, no halo yet, of course, because that has to be conferred later, but this rookie angel stands up and says, well, the last year I worked, I made $500,000 in my law practice. And St. Peter says, impressive. And the second angel, the applicant, comes up And same two questions. My 1040 form to the IRS showed last year I made $350,000. I've been in commercial real estate virtually all of my life. And St. Peter says, significant sum. And so the third person comes up, and it's that angel's turn. I earned $8,000 last year. And with a knowing smile and what have you, St. Peter just looks and says, what instrument did you play? So I don't know how many artists there are in our diminished audience this morning, or how many people are listening in on Zoom, but for anyone who's tried to make a living as a musician, or even egg money as a musician, it doesn't pay well, except for the exceptional top level of performers. And so $8,000 is probably about right for an applicant to heaven these days. Yeah, next slide, please. So where do we start? I couldn't find a precise starting point for music in Sturgis. I'm going to guess it was here with the first people, the first non-native people that came in and created the community as we know it today. And certainly the natives that were here before us would have been drumming and singing and dancing. So the rhythm of music, the magic of music, and all of that has been part of this community forever, really. This is one of the earliest photographs that show a musical organization in Sturgis, and this is from 1888. And you probably cannot read the text of the people in the group, but in the back row, from the left, George Beesman, who lived to be a bazillion years old and was a businessman, volunteer fireman, an important guy in Sturgis. And then next to him is a person who is unidentified. Then the tallest person in the group there is William Henry Grams, the anchor man of the Grams family coming to the Sturgis area. And he would be the great-grandfather of Bob Grams and older brother Bill today. And then there's Charles Moody, who's the band leader, George Hattebrink, two unidentified men. Then seated, there's Mike Godin, Henry Fruth, William Waldman, then three identified people, and finally Albert Anderson. And just a word about, these were men, obviously. They played brass instruments for the most part, which was an easy, economical way to bring music into a community. The instruments were pretty durable, relatively easy to learn how to play at least fundamental things. And so that was often a part of a brass band for any community out here on the prairie, or probably anywhere in the United States. Influences from Germany, other countries in Western Europe that brought the music with them as immigrants, or the sons and grandsons of American immigrants to be in a brass band. All of the Hills communities had brass bands of one kind or another, almost from their founding. Great competition among the communities of whose band was better. Competition about the uniforms. There's a goofy picture that I don't have in my slideshow today of some 19th century Sturgis guys dressed up in their band uniforms, and they all look silly by today's standards. These goofy uniforms with braid and fake military medals and this, that, and the other. But there was part of the show, and that's just how it works. So next slide, please. And just a final little reminder about William Henry Grams. He was also a violin maker. And I think a lot of folks, if you paid attention to Sturgis history from the old days and in very recent times, he was the violin maker who made the violin that one violin was given as a gift to President Coolidge when he was here in the Black Hills in 1927. And Bill Grams tells me that the family believes that that violin, that instrument, is still somewhere in the Smithsonian's archives. It's not on display, but they still they own the instrument and they have it. It hasn't been moved to Vermilion where it probably should be, but anyway, that was one violin. Then he also fashioned the violin in tribute to his grandson, who was killed in a sleigh riding accident off the north side of Weber Hill. And Senator Bill Grams and his brother were sleigh riding, and Bill's brother, they were very close in age, crashed into a cedar fence post and was killed. And the grandpa took the wood from that post and built a violin for it. And that instrument is in the Grams family. And the youngest Bill Grams, my high school classmate, built a display case for that violin, and it's at the courthouse, I believe. And along with the story of what that instrument meant to the Grams family. Here's just another photograph of the high school orchestra from 1913. Their orchestras were often woven into school music early on, and I don't think that today, can you study violin in the Sturgis school system? No. That takes kind of another level up of school district budget and available faculty and the like to bring stringed instruments in at the high school level. So, but here they were in 1913, fiddling away, as it were, and with some brass instruments as well. So, next slide, please. Now, here's the school band from somewhere in the years 1927 to 1936. And I just point this out for a couple of reasons. One, to illustrate that it's still just boys. And I don't know, girls got introduced into instrumental music somewhere along the way, but in the late 20s, early 30s, it was just an all-male organization, heavy on brass instruments. And the gentleman in the middle, the adult in the middle with the military hat on, is an active duty member of the cavalry unit at Fort Meade. And he is a technical sergeant, Quinto Ferretti. And he was a military musician, born and educated in Italy, as were many late 19th century and early 20th century military musicians. And I've got a hunch that in those days, that was a path to citizenship for them, just like it is today for immigrants who join the military forces and can kind of get moved to the head of the line in some instances with their goal of achieving U.S. citizenship. So this fellow comes along. He's the senior NCO in the band, and I haven't been able to find yet a news story to find out if he was a volunteer faculty member at Sturgis High School or if he was somehow paid for his working. But he got time off from his military job to come 2 miles into town and lead the high school band. Maybe it wasn't every day, and maybe subject to his availability, but nonetheless he was the conductor for all those years. And when I first saw this picture, I thought, oh, this was just a one-off deal. This is because his son, he had 4 children. One of his sons is a clarinet player, and I don't know which lad his son is. And I'm thinking, oh, it's just a generous dad who's helping out. And somebody took this picture, and that was it. But he's in the yearbook, he's listed in the faculty, and in news stories and the like. So it wasn't just a one-shot deal of somebody helping out the school. From Fort Meade in 36 and 37, he was transferred to Hawaii. And I don't think that he was still on active duty during World War II. By then he would have been old enough he would have retired. His family, the big chunk of the family settled in Missouri, and he went there into retirement and died there. He was in his mid-70s when he passed away. So that's Ferretti and his story of how he's woven in to the music of Sturgis. And a little bit later on, I'll talk a bit more about Fort Meade and the role that Fort Meade played. So Next slide, please. This is a direct quote that made all of us double entendre boys in high school snicker. But Kent Frohrick one day was exasperated with us, and in the band room in the Williams building upstairs there, where we all learned to play, and he cracked the baton on the podium one more time, and it was this blow, don't suck. So we blew, and but anyway, this is just a representation of the many band directors that have been part of high school music in Sturgis. The fellow on the far left, the kind of stern-looking gent in the faux military uniform, is Arlie Richardson. And he was here from 1936 to 39. And when the high school band had gained some substance to it, they had uniforms, full of instrumentation, and music would have been an important part of school life. This gent is credited with being the first high school band director in the Black Hills, at least, and maybe all of the state or the region, with using sound motion picture technology to film the band in practice, so that then he could show the kids that, like a training film, think of that analogy from football or sports, to show the kids that where they were doing well and where they were making mistakes. And it was a big deal. There were news stories about it, and he would have been a pace setter. And I want to be in the school board meeting when they're signing off on the bills, and this guy comes in and he needs $200 or whatever, probably to rent the equipment or to pay a cinematographer to come with not only just a movie camera, but the sound equipment also to put the two things together. That would have been a big deal in the 1930s, just at the end of the Depression and the like, for good old Sturgis. The next older gent on the top row is Burns Edson Taft. And that's a name that just doesn't roll off. But he was an interesting guy, a South Dakotan, East River guy, college educated in South Dakota. Came after Richardson left and took over the music program, largely the band program in Sturgis, and had an interesting career. He bounced around between Sturgis, Newell, Vail. Then he went out of state for a couple of years. Along the way, he became an ordained congregational minister. And then he would be a clergyman for a while, then he'd be a band director for a while. And so sticking with it, and probably evidence of what it took for a clergyman teacher in the 1930s to put food on the table. You had to scratch around and find wages wherever you could. Kent Frohrick, my band director in high school, is the fellow with the whiskers, and neat guy. When he came here, and I'll talk about his predecessor in just a moment, but when he came to Sturgis, we band kids were excited because it was a big change in style, if nothing else, in the band room. He was a great deal younger. He was a full generation younger than Francis Benson. A red-hot, ripping trombone player. He smoked cigarettes in the band room. We could always tell when he was a little nervous before a football game or a concert or something like that, because the band room would be kind of smoky. And he later quit. But anyway, Mr. Frohrick lived into his 90s. He passed away last year. And he left Sturgis and went to St. Cloud, Minnesota, and was on the university faculty there for another 30 plus years. And I stopped in to see him one day when I was in that part of Minnesota. We had a nice hour-long visit and all of that. He's still every bit really dedicated dedicated educator and a very talented musician. Frohrit was followed by Leo Getzko, who's still here. I think he lives in Rapid City now, but still very much with us and recovering from COVID. I talked to him on the phone about a week ago, and he had a few tales to tell that'll be more pertinent to the performance part of this program, talking about some of his outstanding, the handful or so really, really talented musicians that he remembered during his years in the band room in Sturgis. And a dedicated educator, a man in his 90s, who I think if he would have felt a little bit better, and I'm a stranger to him, and I just called him on the phone and all of that. I think over a cup of coffee or a beer or whatever would have a little more to say about just the day-to-day, I don't want to use the word grind, but the day-to-day duty of being a teacher in a public school system and teaching band, teaching music, and what that, classroom management and all of the other things that went along with that. And when you're a band director, the extra energy that you have to work at night and for every concert, and the extra rehearsals and travel with your kids and all of that, not an easy job. And I don't say that to diminish someone who teaches literature in the high school, but there is a difference, and it takes a specially dedicated person to be a public school music educator. The young man in the 70s vintage glasses there, that's Don Downs. Taught in Sturgis for a few years, and I used his picture as an example of someone who's moves on and still stays a music educator. He went to Rapid City and had finished out a retirement-length career as the director of bands at Stevens High School. And then Dave Martinson, many of you will recognize, still here in Sturgis, part of the city council, long tenured member of the Sturgis High School faculty, saxophone player, jazz musician, certainly left an imprint on the community in the training and of the dedication of what he did for music in the community. And then Gary Nelson is the fellow on the right. And Gary, and I don't know Mr. Nelson, but he holds the record for being the longest tenured music teacher in the Sturgis school system, and principally as the middle school music teacher. And I'm guessing, well, all of these gentlemen, but this guy earned his pay, and then some. If you junior high age kids, I was a Boy Scout leader for a long time, and I can remember how challenging it was to get largely junior high age boys to not kill themselves and stay focused on the task and have fun along the way. And so that's just a sample of the high school music educators that were part of Sturgis, and kind of where they came from. Obviously all college educated, many of them with advanced degrees and the like, and truly dedicated. So next slide, please. And then school choir. Starting on the top row on the left is Mildred Howie, and she was on the faculty in 1912. And then a woman with the horn-rimmed glasses, I could only find her name as Mrs. Spain. And she was here in the late 20s, and of course in that era, women had no first name. They had their husband's first name. Or they would carry the burden of being Miss forever. But so Mrs. Spain was a choir teacher. And then we're going to jump, I'm jumping a time window here that'll come up in the next slide. Stan Wright is the older smiling gentleman there in the middle in the color picture. Mr. Wright came to Sturgis High School my senior year. That would have been 1964-65. He replaced Chuck Thielen. An impossible job, but he did it. He was on the faculty for 1 year, and black and white, salt and pepper, you think of ebony and ivory, you think of the opposites in your head, that was Mr. Wright and Mr. Thielen, and how they were different in their style and their approach to things. And Stanley Wright, he should have been paid double for working in the high school that very difficult, very challenging year. We kids gave him fits all along the way. We missed Mr. Thielen and his irreverence and style, showmanship. And Mr. Wright, who was an excellent musician, was all about the skill of singing. And Mr. Thielen was a lot more about the making the audience laugh and smile and all of that. And so they were just different gentlemen. And one war story from, it would have been in the spring of the year, and the choir room in the high school then was on the west side of the school. Got beastly hot in the afternoon, but we had choir was scheduled the hour right before lunch, and I don't remember what the circumstance was, but Mr. Wright had to leave the choir room for a moment to talk to a faculty member, or I can't remember now what the circumstance was. But the boys who were seated up in the back of the very back row of the choir, the baritones, were right next to the windows. And those windows could be open, and this was in the spring, and so the window was open, let in fresh air and all of that. And I'll just reveal his name because he's not here to defend himself. But Bill Manier, whose dad was the manager of the dime store downtown, the Lee's variety store. Bill Manier, who's a really good singer, as were all of the Manier kids. Bill is back there, and Mr. Wright leaves the room, the door shut behind him, and the minute that happened, classroom discipline and whatever else just goes, it's chaos. And all of a sudden Bill says, "I need a cigarette." And so they pull up the curtains, and he, and I don't know who else, but it was Bill, they get out their pack and they light up, and they're blowing smoke out the window of the band room. And Mr. Wright comes back in, and there's bedlam in the room, and because we're all snickering and whatever at the audacity of Bill and his accomplices. And Stan Wright comes in. "Oh, what's going on? Okay, come on back," and taps his baton. And we've got to get back to business here. And by then he's, "What's going on in here?" And he can smell the tobacco smoke. And so he storms up the risers and the boys are all just, they're angels applying for heaven, "No, not me, not me, not me." And I'm sure the butt is still burning outside of the window where they threw it into the grass. But that was, Stan earned his pay, that's for sure. And a tough guy. He's married to a Phyllis Barker from Sturgis. They came back here in 1997 for the 100th anniversary all-school reunion, and he led the combined choir. He's still very much a music educator and the like. So he exited from town, but he didn't get run out of town. And I admire the man for having the courage to come back and one more time face students. And I don't think Bill Manier attended that reunion, or there would have been. Anyway, Dave Blagan is next, son of a Lutheran minister, East River kid. Didn't stay in Sturgis all that many years. Went to Worthington, Minnesota, and finished out a long career as a music educator. Lyle Merriman is the fellow with the necktie in the bottom left. And I don't know him or know anything about him, except that he's from Howard, South Dakota. He was Weary Willie at South Dakota State when he was an undergraduate. And he was the director of the Statesman, which was the all-male chorus from South Dakota State. And that was they were an impressive singing group in the 60s and 70s, and I presume still are. But for him to be chosen as a student, to be the lead, I think he was a graduate student then, to be the leader of that group, meant that he had to have some chops in order to be able to do that. Next is Judy White, who had a long and storied tenure here as a teacher and a successful music educator. Her husband got reassigned and they left in the middle of the school year. And that must have been a gasp in the audience when she announced that it was they were going to be leaving. And Bob Stretch Donaldson stepped up, a trombone player, for heaven's sake, stepped across, I guess, from his math teaching job and led the school choir for the rest of the school year. So you have to be flexible when you're on the faculty at Sturgis High School. And I think there's more than one. There always have been teachers in the Sturgis school system who are part Swiss Army knife. And they do whatever needs to be done. And so that's the example. The next fellow there is Dave Farkas, if I'm saying his name right. Was both a choir and band teacher, because in the 80s and 90s here in Sturgis, the school district there was quite a bit of turmoil in the music faculty, and occasionally a teacher would be hired and have to do double duty and be both the band and choir director. In the early 70s, I can remember coming to a high school basketball tournament here when I was still a reporter at the Sturgis Tribune, and the Grunwald Auditorium was hosting all of the B schools, so Buffalo and Bison and Faith and towns like that had come to Sturgis to play their basketball tournament. And I don't remember the town anymore, but the basketball coach was also the band director. And so he put down his towel and he picked up a baton and he led the school's pep band, and then he put the baton down and picked up his towel, went over and coached the kids in basketball. So, and that probably still goes on to some degree or another. And then the final person that is there is Jeanne, if I'm saying her name right, Hoffman. And I used her picture just as a representation of a more contemporary faculty member for the choir. Barkas left Sturgis, and he was already in his 30s, and he joined the Army National Guard band in Mitchell, and went on active duty and did his preparatory training, came home then, and was a long-serving member of the 147th Army Band that's headquartered in Mitchell. And he continued on as a music educator, but not here in the Black Hills. So, next slide, please. This is not a photograph of Dean Martin and Lawrence Welk. But that's about how different these two gents were. Chuck Phelan on the left and Francis Benson on the right. Both excellent musicians, excellent educators, but their style, their approach to things, and what have you, they were polar opposites for lots of reasons. Phelan is an Aberdeen native, went to school at Northern, was in the Marine Corps in Korea, served in combat in Korea, came home. His wife Nancy was an accomplished pianist. She was Miss South Dakota in the early 50s. And Chuck Phelan was a showman. There's no other, I can't describe him with any other word than that. He and Nancy had 3 children. Christy Phelan, who lives in Belfouche, has been involved in the arts community in the Black Hills all of her life, I think. They have another son who is a now retired law enforcement officer. And then Andy Phelan lives in coastal North Carolina and is the leader, manager, whatever, of a big orchestra there. Kind of one of the last big full-up show band orchestras on the East Coast. And if you go to YouTube and just search Andy Phelan Orchestra or Andrew Phelan Orchestra, and his group plays all of the big venues on the East Coast where they need a big 20-piece orchestra, and the female singers, male singers, a request list that is endless. And Andy Thielen is a drummer, like his dad, Chuck, and really, really talented musicians. And he would have, young Andy would have learned at the hand of his dad and mom his musical talents. Francis Benson was from the little town of Trent, South Dakota, which is halfway between Flandreau and Del Rapids. Went to school at Augustana, was principally a clarinet player, taught in a couple small schools before he came to Sturgis. And he was hired to restart the high school music program after World War II. Just like the rally took a couple years off for the war, the high school music program just got put in mothballs with no faculty member. There still was a student pep band, and Betty Peterson Bell was the student leader of the pep band. And so, but Mr. Benson was this kind of stern, no-nonsense technician of playing. And I gave up trying to teach me how to triple tongue the cornet. He had better places to spend his time than with me. And a nice gentleman, dedicated to teaching and all of that, but not a flashy guy. He was Mr. Serious. He was Lawrence Welk, and Thielen was the Rat Pack. And that's how those two guys were different. So, next slide, please. A word about what music does for students, or some words about what music does for students in teaching leadership skills as well as skills as musicians, and how important that becomes as life lessons for these people here. This is largely the class of 1966. So Ross Lushbaugh, Bonnie Hoshino, Mary Kelly, Claire Wood, and Paul Burgett. All of them continued on involved in music some way or another into their adult lives. Paul Burgett on the right is a professional musician. He's in his 70s now, still working, lives in Minneapolis, and is largely a lute player. He hung up his rock and roll talents probably more than a decade or two ago, and is largely a classical music person now. He was a Fort Meade kid, and another influence, I guess, of music in Fort Meade and how that's woven into the Sturgis community. But these students, these 17 and 18-year-olds, I chose this picture because I just wanted to address the whole notion of a person involved in musical training and in musical performance, particularly as a young person, learns a great deal more than just the notes on the paper or on the sheet music that's in front of you. And those become priceless lessons. Our two kids had the benefit of being in a public school music program back in Virginia where they were largely raised. And to this day, they are in their 40s. And if you get them to reminisce about what it was like to be in the high school music program then, very quickly, they'll highlight a couple of musical things, but then they'll talk about the socializing, the leadership skills, and the other disciplines that they learned from being involved in a school music program. And I gotta trust that still goes on today with kids that are involved in music. There's all kinds of academic study that points to how students who take music training do well in school in other subjects. Didn't help me with math, but that was just a shortcoming of my own, I think. I could do a 1 and a 2, but I could never put together 3 and 4 times X over the square root of something else. I quickly got lost. But musical leadership is just another benefit. Next slide, please. Now, St. Martin's. We just like we have to talk about Fort Meade, we certainly have to talk about the role that St. Martin's Academy played in music training and in music performance in this community. Not only for the student body that was enrolled at St. Martin's, but the additional students that were the pupils, particularly of Sister Clement, the lady on the upper left. And her reputation, her talents, her skills, the influence that she had in the community. My older sister was a pupil of Sister Clement, public school educated, but she demonstrated enough skill and interest in the piano that my mom drug up the money from somewhere, and I'm sure that Sister Clement didn't necessarily charge premium prices, but you had to pay for the lesson, of course. And my sister today will remember how intimidating she was, but how much you learned, and because of her requirements for practice and excellence and all of that, it becomes one of those double lessons that not only did you learn technical things, but you also learned stuff for your head as well. The history is a little fuzzy on, if she wasn't the first woman to lead a high school band in South Dakota, she was among the first 3 or 4 women school faculty members who were band leaders in what had previously been an all-male expectation or requirement. And then she had a colleague, Sister Mary David, who also was a piano teacher, but then went on to become a school administrator at St. Martin's. But 2 important ladies who gave much to the musical world here. So next slide, please. Sturgis has also had a long list of private lesson piano teachers as well, and I've got to trust that still goes on today. And if you're a youngster here in town and you express an interest in learning to play the piano, why, there's someone here that will give lessons. Among the earliest that I could find, just in newspaper accounts, there was a woman named Marion Minty Sherman, and she was a piano teacher in the 1930s. There was a woman named Catherine Creed, who was on the St. Martin's music faculty in the 1930s. And then by the late 1950s, Margaret Means is here in town teaching lessons from 58 to 67. Her 3 daughters were all accomplished pianists and accompanists for the school choir and the like. And Mrs. Means was the accompanist for the Lions Club and the Rotary Club here in town. And then the lady who's pictured here is Marvell Braden Means, another private lesson piano teacher here in town. And I've talked to both her son and daughter about what it was like to live in a house where music lessons were taught, and how Chuck Braden remembers that it didn't make any difference to him. When he wanted to walk across the living room during the lesson, he just did it. His sister had a different approach, or more polite maybe than at all. But Chuck remembers that his mom was a by-the-book, play what is written music teacher. And that was her technique, that was her approach to music. And also went on to a long, long tenure here in town of being an accompanist for church groups, civic groups, weddings and funerals, and the like. Other music teachers here, Virginia Hardy. Elaine Owens was an important accompanist. She didn't teach lessons, not formally anyway. Nancy Phelan, who, when the Phelans moved from Sturgis to Rapid City, she moved her piano teaching career to Rapid City and opened up a studio here and taught hundreds of kids how to play the piano. One of the first music teachers in the area to embrace technology using electronic keyboards and teaching more than one student at a time, things like that from her studio. Margaret Phillips was a Fort Meade mom, and she taught piano and organ lessons from the home out at the fort. And then in modern times, Roxy Bracewell Chapman was just all things music and all things theater here in the community as a relatively young adult, teaching here. And then when Dennis's military career took them around the world, she was absent for a period of time, and then when they returned, she continued on, of course, as an important part of the music scene in the Sturgis community. And next slide, please. Church choirs. Every church had a choir, often more than one. A children's choir, an adult choir, small groups, large groups. That meant an accompanist or the organist for that church. So that was another assignment, another opportunity to perform. Frequently the church choirs would come together for, particularly at Christmas, for the Messiah, and what all that would mean to the community for rehearsals and presentations, and more of the glue, the social and artistic glue of the town that keeps things together. This was just an available photograph from the Presbyterian Church. And next slide, please, which leads into Peggy Thompson. And I pretty much missed Mrs. Thompson as a teacher. We attended the Presbyterian Church, my sister and I did, and everybody, of course, knew who she was. And by the time I was old enough to sort of pay attention and the like, I wasn't involved in the church music much at all anymore, but certainly when Mrs. Thompson was in the room, or Peggy, as I think we all were able to call her, it was just this fireball lady with red curly hair and her big 1970s glasses, and she walked 100 miles an hour, I think, everywhere she went in the sanctuary of the church or elsewhere. And I talked with her niece, Nancy Harlan, about her aunt and the influence that she had on 4-H and on the music scene here in Sturgis. So an important lady, and I'm sure that she wasn't alone. There were other volunteer music leaders in the community that had similar amounts of talent and energy that they shared with the town. And if you go to the Bear Butte Cemetery and see where she and Clayton are buried, why the covering of her grave is a big slab of granite with a treble clef etched on it. So make no mistake about it. She's still, and she's in heaven. And she's, those applicants that are, divulging what their occupations and salaries were, Mrs. Thompson is there. We need 3 second tenors, 2 basses, an alto, for today's choir. Get over here. And she would have them whipped into shape and able to perform by supper time. Just that kind of a lady. She was a native of Indiana, by the way, and her parents died, and she came out here, or her mother died, and her dad remarried and came out here to the Black Hills. And so she spent her teenage growing up years in the Piedmont area, went to high school in Rapid City, then college, and married Clayton. And I've already told you a little bit about what she has done. So next slide, please. My mom found the money in the bottom of her purse, somewhere or another, to buy for me my cornet, the student model horn that I used when I was starting to play in Mr. Benson's band as a 5th grader. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the music retail business here. Where did you get your horn? Where did you get a piano? Where did you have it repaired? Where did you buy valve oil, sheet music, the other things that it takes to participate in music? Well, the earliest recollection I could find was Ron Moss. And the Moss Music Store was on Main Street across the way from Penny's. I don't remember which street address it was, but it was a relatively small retail space. And he had his store there. He was a native of Wisconsin, played in military bands as a young adult, then hung around in the Wisconsin area. He's from Watertown, Wisconsin. Played with no less than Herb Schreiner, and you have to be of a certain age to remember who Herb Schreiner was. I talk to people from Indiana, they don't know who Herb Schreiner was, but he was an important musician and an early 50s TV star as well. So Ron Moss played trumpet, and Ron Moss is still alive. He's in his 90s, lives in Juneau, Alaska, and is an important part of the music scene there. He and his wife donated in 2014, I think it is, they donated $100,000 to the arts and a soup kitchen in Juneau. And he was a founding member of the Juneau Symphony, lifelong player in a dance band, and an entrepreneur as well. Interesting character. Left here in something, I don't want to say a cloud of dust, but he was in business on Main Street, and then he was gone. And so the story of how and why he left town is lost to history. And I did exchange a letter with Mr. Moss, and he filled me in a little bit about his career. And of course, the bulk of it has been in Juneau, Alaska, where he really took root, because they went from Sturgis directly to Juneau, and he's been there since. And Cord Wanamaker was a North Dakotan who came to town and opened a music store on First Street, where the Gallery 21 Art Gallery was, at Dean McNinney's place, was. He had a music store, I think, in the back part of that building for a number of years. And I don't know that he was a partner, but he was somehow involved with the Yarborough operation at Tilford and the Square Dance parlor, or barn, the Square Dance barn that was at Tilford for many, many years. In fact, that building was just torn down within the last couple of years. And was involved in the world of square dance. And square dancing in the 50s and 60s was a big deal here in the Black Hills, or in this region. The Rapid City Journal had a weekly column that followed square dance activities and the participants. So there was a lot of crinoline and stringy bow tie, or Western ties for the square dancers of that era. Then Leo Getsko had a retail music store in downtown Sturgis for a few years. And I've just mentioned in the performance piece that I'll talk about here months from now, I'm going to talk more about Ken Buchanan. Ken Buchanan is a Sturgis kid. Grew up with his brothers and sisters in the Crooked House that's on the road to Whitewood. And anybody remember the Crooked House? That's what we all called it. It's an optical illusion. If you drive on the service road from Sturgis to Whitewood and you round the corner, it's about halfway in between. There's a residential home there. And if you're in a car and you drive by, you look at that house and it's like the cosmos. It's like the house is leaning. It's not. But we always knew, well, the Buchanans, they live in the Crooked House. Ken is an accomplished musician, partially retired now. And his wife is a PhD level bassoon player, a college professor, performing musician, and they live in Las Vegas, or in the Las Vegas area. Ken grew up in Sturgis, played for Mr. Getsko, who switched him from being a cornet player to being a euphonium player. And that really clicked for Ken. And went to school at Black Hills, got a degree in performance, stayed in Spearfish as an entrepreneur in the music industry for 10 years, and then was encouraged, I guess, and successful and auditioned to be to go on active duty and he was 33 years old, had to have an age waiver, went on active duty, and served in an Air Force band, or several Air Force bands, through a full retirement career, and just has had an interesting life as a performer, traveling around the world and around the United States, performing and teaching, and certainly still fondly connected to his musical roots here in Sturgis and then in Spearfish at the college. So next slide, please. Okay, I'm coming up on 1 hour here. Music at Fort Meade, and I'll try to pick up the tempo a little bit. There have been musical bands at Fort Meade when the active duty Army was there from the very beginning. Music and the Army, music and the military, they go together. They are welded together for a variety of reasons, some very historic and some very contemporary. But this is a picture of the 4th Cavalry Band, 1927, in front of their barracks. And it's a fuzzy picture, but just to the left of the bass drum is a dog. Military units are famous for having mascots, and the Army Band at Fort Meade had a mascot. And the military bands at Fort Meade had daily duties to perform for reveille and retreat ceremonies. We all have heard bits and pieces of the story about how the Star Spangled Banner was played for the first, regularly played at Fort Meade, and before it was our national anthem, and the like. The bandmasters at Fort Meade and the players are an interesting collection of professional musicians. Many of the early guys were trained in, and they were all women, because the last of the active duty military band left in 1943 when the Army took down the flag at Fort Meade. So these men, in the early days, many of them were trained in Italy, and many of the bandmasters particularly, and the senior leaders in these bands would have had a formal musical training in Italy. And of the many bandmasters, and go to the next slide here, just briefly a little recollection of the It Started Here story, and how it was 1892, the 8th Cavalry was the unit of record at Fort Meade, and the wife of the commander encouraged him to order the band to play the Star Spangled Banner. Wasn't the national anthem then, but to play the Star Spangled Banner each day at the retreat ceremony, the late afternoon ceremony when they take down the flag. And so it started at Fort Meade, this routine playing of that song as part of a military ceremony. By 1916, the tune had become popular enough and the practice had become popular enough that President Wilson signed an executive order requiring the entire military establishment to use the Francis Scott Key's music, and it was a borrowed tune, but Francis Scott Key's lyrics put to music, so that would be played in the Navy and the Marine Corps, as well as in the Army. And then by 1931, the U.S. Congress designates the Star Spangled Banner as the national anthem, and so that's where we are with that song today. So next slide, please. This is the commander of the 8th Cavalry back in the very last of the 19th century, who listened to his wife, smart man, and got the band to play the Star Spangled Banner. He was 18th in his class of 22 at West Point. So, he didn't set the world on fire in college, but he did go on to a long and distinguished military career, and lived to be an old man, and is buried in Cleveland. So next slide, please. So now the bandmasters. This is just one of probably 25 warrant officers who were the successive leaders of the military bands at Fort Meade. They all carried the rank, just the bandmaster carried the military rank of warrant officer. So they would have been called Mr., whatever their last name was, and not colonel or lieutenant or captain or whatever their warrant officer called Mr., or and in today's military, Ms. or Mrs. or Miss, whatever is appropriate. The early ones were trained in Italy. They often had side gigs in the civilian world, the bandmasters as well as their players. And that was a significant footprint, musical note, in the Black Hills region. In the 1930s, there was a bandmaster, and he was here for a long while, who was the director of the Rapid City Municipal Band in the summertime. And a couple of his soldiers went with him, and they were players in the municipal band. And in those days, I think like today, if you played in the town's summer band, you got a little salary for playing, $2 a performance or something like that. And this particular bandmaster had to take the Rapid City Council to court to collect on back wages that they were slow in paying. And it was almost $400. And so that would have been some important money, worth a fight, and hiring a lawyer to go to court over and the like. There was another story that I found of a bandmaster in 1883. Mr. Schick was the 7th Cavalry's bandmaster. And he was away on some kind of duty. He wasn't at the fort, but his wife was living on the fort. And he posted a $200 reward to find the man who assaulted his wife with a club and bring this person to justice. And if you read the news story there, it talks about the bandmaster's wife is assaulted. And then deeper down in the story, and she's assaulted with the club. And then parenthetically in the news story, it says there were no other forms of ravishment foisted off against this woman. Well, then it turns out that her nephew and the lady had an argument over the nephew's mistreatment of a horse. And his aunt scolded him, and maybe more, for treating a horse badly. And he came back to settle the score, and he beat up his aunt. And but he wasn't charged. Finally, there were no charges brought for lack of evidence, and no further ravishments either. So anyway, there was another musician at Fort Meade, a bandmaster, and there's some confusion. The last name is Bierman. And there, later on in military history, there was a Sergeant Bierman, a military musician, who got sent to prison at Fort Leavenworth for refusing to play the national anthem and another patriotic tune. This was in the 1930s. He wanted to play German music. And yeah, he got court-martialed and went to jail over that. And I can't find if Warrant Officer Bierman and his Sergeant Bierman are the same person. They may not be, but it was the imprisonment of this guy was noted in the Sturgis papers. So, in 1937, go ahead to the next slide, please. Members of the 4th Cavalry Band went to Mount Rushmore and hiked up the hill, hauled their instruments up in a little trolley car that they used to carry dynamite and tools and things up and down the carving. They worried about, would the bass drum fall out of the little gondola car that it must not have. But anyway, they were there to play for the dedication of the Lincoln face in 1937. And Mr. Sidwell, the same guy that took the city council in Rapid to court for back wages, is still the band director. And he's in the far right. You can just see a white gloved hand in the picture, and the other band members are down there. About 30 soldiers went up there to perform music, and they had another trumpet player who was the echo bugler who stood on Washington's head as part of the show. performance for the dedication of the Lincoln face on Mount Rushmore. And I know of at least one longtime Sturgis resident who was a young soldier in the band at that time, and that's Cecil Barnes. And Mr. Barnes was our Comanche Court neighbor when I was growing up, and continued on largely as a keyboard guy, piano and organ. And the man whistled all the time. The minute the front door or the back door shut behind him and he was outside, you could hear him whistle. And so, oh, Cecil's home. Cecil's outside. And but he was he was from Sioux Falls originally, a clarinet player, and was recruited or volunteered to serve in the Army as a military musician, and was in the 4th Cavalry Band at Fort Meade, and then stayed here. Lots of 4th Cavalry soldiers stayed in Sturgis following their military service. He's the only one that I know of who is a musician. There may have been others. So, and then just to wrap up about Fort Meade and the like, the last Fort Meade band to play, and all of these military bands from the very beginning, not only did they perform at the fort on a day-to-day basis, but they were constantly giving concerts, small ensemble performances, things like that. Sergeant Ferretti's the director of the high school band, for heaven's sakes. So they were woven into the community, maybe as much or more than the regular soldiers were. The soldiers would have had duty at the fort with the horses and the other equipment, but the band, of course, is tailor-made to go out and be ambassadors beyond the gates of the installation. And so all of these bands did that. The last band at Fort Meade was the 88th Glider Regiment, 1943, just as World War II was really heating up. And for about 10 months, the Glider Regiment is at Fort Meade, and they have a band. And they would give concerts, and in one of the news stories about the concert that was going to be presented, they listed the credentials of all of the players in the band. So this would have been the U.S. Army of the early 1940s. World War II was going on. Probably most of the members in the band were drafted. The warrant officer who was the leader of the band, and if you look down into these credentials of the band players, they are graduates of Juilliard, the Boston Conservatory, Cleveland, other high-end performance training institutions. And then, while the war comes along, you're going to serve, and you're not in the infantry, I'm in the band, and it was a good duty for them. So I can imagine that the quality of the music that was performed here was pretty high-end in Sturgis and in the other Black Hills communities. So, where are we today? Well, I haven't lived in Sturgis for decades, and can only kind of listen and catch on to what might be going on in the school system today. So I'll leave it to you folks and others in the Zoom audience to kind of fill in the blanks, I guess, of what. It's not quite history yet because it's not old enough, and you have to wait for some people to pass away so you can tell stories about it. And they're not here to defend themselves, so that's where we are. The next program that I'm starting to work on, and I encourage you, your friends, anyone in the Zoom audience, to please get in touch with me with ideas, sound recordings, pictures, anything that you might have that pertains to performance of music in Sturgis. At least 2 pupils from the Sturgis Public School System have gone on to perform on Broadway. Jenny Fellner in recent years, and her sister, by the way, is an equally accomplished musician. And then Paul Burgett also was on Broadway in the early 1970s as a fresh college graduate. And elsewhere, other people like Ken Buchanan, who was in a military band for a very long while, and other people, there have been other Sturgis pupils, students, Sturgis musicians who've gone on to perform in military organizations. And the other thing we can't forget, absolutely don't want to forget, for the second stanza of this, are all of the dance bands, the garage bands, call them what you will, the family bands that have grown up from Sturgis. The Stories, there was the McPhersons, gosh, the names are out of my head at the moment, but lots of families, moms and dads, the Dennises, moms and dads and cousins and brothers and whatever would be in these country dance bands to play out in the county, in the various community halls and places like that. So that I want to weave into the story as well as, of course, what's been going on in the public school system and with the informal, or not informal, but the home training that goes on for musicians these days. All of the garage band musicians, whether it's Dick Kopp or Paul Burgett or Lauren Erickson or Dennis Millick or some of the other rock and rollers that were here in the late 60s and early 70s, they had to largely teach themselves how to play. Guitar teachers were few and far between in those years. And a lot of those musicians learned their lessons well, and we'll talk about them in the second movement. So, I've run long on time, and I've got to get back to Rapid City. Are there questions or comments that anyone wants to add to all of this?
Different instruments right now. We'll go lunch.